Her uncle's hand came down on the table like a gavel. "Sign it." Harold Rowan didn't ask. He never asked. He slid the paper across the dining room table, the same table where Lydia had eaten every meal since she was 4 years old, and tapped it twice with one thick finger. "Sign it tonight, or I start the eviction process Monday morning." Lydia stared at the document. Her parents had been dead for 11 days. 11 days. The dirt on their graves was still fresh. She could still smell the church flowers in her hair from the funeral, and her uncle was already here, already pushing a pen toward her hand, already wearing that look. Not grief, not even the performance of grief, just impatience, the kind a man wears when he's been waiting a long time for something, and finally, the obstacle standing between him and it has been removed. That obstacle had been her parents. Now the only obstacle left was her. "You have until Monday," Harold said again, already pulling on his coat. "Don't be foolish, Lydia. You're 18. You have no money, no husband, no plan. Take the settlement and be grateful." The door shut behind him. The house went quiet, and Lydia Rowan sat alone at that table, staring at a document designed to strip away the last thing her parents had ever left her. And she made a decision that would change every single thing about her life. She didn't sign it. Yet, if you've ever been left with nothing but a choice and the terrifying freedom that comes with it, this story is for you. If you're new here, welcome. Hit that subscribe button right now, because the stories we tell on this channel have a way of staying with you. Drop a like and leave a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. The advertisement was small. So small that Lydia nearly missed it entirely, tucked between a listing for farm equipment and a notice about a missing dog on page 7 of the Helena Gazette, a newspaper she'd only picked up because it had been left on the bench at the train station where she'd been sitting for 2 hours, not going anywhere, just sitting because she had nowhere to go. Rancher, widower, 34, seeks capable woman for marriage and partnership. Montana Frontier, cattle operation, honest work, honest living. Respond to C. Mercer, Box 114, Copperfield, Montana. She read it 3 times. Then she folded the paper in half, tucked it into her coat pocket, and walked to the post office. She wrote the letter standing at the counter because she didn't have a table to sit at anymore. 6 sentences. Her name, her age, her situation stated plainly. Orphaned, dispossessed, willing to work. And one line at the end that she almost crossed out before deciding to leave it. "I am not looking to be saved. I am looking for a fair chance." She mailed it before she could change her mind. The response came 12 days later to the boarding house where she'd been renting a cot for 60 cents a night. The handwriting was uneven but deliberate, like someone who hadn't written many letters but was trying to do it properly. Caleb Mercer's words were blunt and sparse, almost uncomfortable to read. No warmth, no flattery, none of the practiced sweetness she might have expected from a lonely man answering his own advertisement. "Miss Rowan, I received your letter. I have a working ranch, 400 acres, cattle, one hired hand named Ellis who has been with me 8 years. The house needs work. I won't lie about that. Winters are brutal, and the nearest town is 14 miles by horse. If you are serious and not looking for comfort, write again. If you're looking for comfort, don't." She wrote again that same afternoon. "Mr. Mercer, I grew up in a city and I have never ridden a horse. I cannot cook well. I have no experience with cattle or cold weather or hard labor. But I learn quickly and I don't complain and I will not waste your time. If that is enough to start, I'll be on the next available train." His response arrived in 4 days this time. 1 sentence. "Train arrives, Copperfield Station Tuesday. I'll be there." The night before she left, Lydia went back to her parents' house. She stood on the sidewalk outside it for a long time, looking at the dark windows. Harold had already changed the locks. She could see the new brass hardware glinting on the front door. Someone had moved her mother's window box. The petunias her mother had planted every spring for 15 years were gone, replaced with nothing, just bare wood. She didn't try to go in. There was nothing left inside that was hers. She had one bag. A change of clothes, her mother's silver hairbrush, a photograph she'd taken from a box before Harold had arrived, and $43 folded inside her left shoe. Money she'd earned in 2 weeks working mornings at a laundry, the only place that had hired her without references or a husband's name to put on the form. $43 and a train ticket to a place she'd never heard of, to marry a man she'd never met. Lydia Rowan stood on that sidewalk until her feet went cold, and then she walked away without looking back. She told herself it was because she was brave. It was actually because she was afraid that if she looked back, she'd lose her nerve entirely. The train ride to Montana took 3 days. She'd expected the time to feel long, but it passed in a strange blur of shifting landscape and noise and the smell of coal smoke that worked its way into everything she wore. She shared her car with a family of 5 heading to Oregon, an elderly man who slept most of the route, and 2 women about her age who were clearly traveling together and clearly had money and clearly had no interest in conversation with anyone who didn't. Lydia sat with her bag on her lap for the first 6 hours before she finally let herself put it in the overhead rack. She didn't sleep much. She watched the landscape change. She had grown up with streets and buildings, with the particular urban rhythm of people moving past each other in constant, indifferent proximity. But the further west the train pushed, the more that world dissolved, replaced by something vast and flat and relentless that made her feel very, very small in a way she hadn't anticipated. She thought about the letter. Winters are brutal. She thought about her $43. She thought about Harold, sitting in her parents' dining room right now, probably with his feet up, probably already redecorating. The anger was useful. She held on to it. Copperfield Station was barely a station. One platform, one small building that served as both ticket office and post room, a water tower, and a handful of people standing around in the gray morning light with the particular stillness of people who had nowhere urgent to be. Lydia stepped off the train with her bag and looked around and felt, for one completely unguarded moment, like she was going to be sick. There was no one holding a sign with her name. She didn't know what Caleb Mercer looked like. She'd never asked, and he'd never offered, and it hadn't seemed important until right now, standing on a platform in a town where she knew no one, watching strangers collect their belongings and move off in directions that all meant something to them and meant nothing to her. She stood very still and told herself to think. He said Tuesday. This was Tuesday. He said he'd be here. Miss Rowan. The voice came from her left. Not a question. A statement, flat and certain, which was itself interesting. She turned. Caleb Mercer was taller than she'd imagined, though she wasn't sure why she'd imagined anything at all. He was wearing a canvas work coat and a hat that had seen considerable weather. He had dark eyes set under heavy brows, a jaw that had about 3 days of stubble on it, and the particular kind of stillness that some people carry when they've spent years in places where unnecessary movement is a waste of energy. I wasn't looking at her with warmth, exactly, but he wasn't looking at her with the measuring appraisal she'd been bracing for either. He was looking at her the way you look at something unfamiliar that you've decided to take seriously. That's me, she said. A pause. You're younger than I expected, he said. You're quieter than I expected, she said back. Something crossed his face. Not a smile. Not quite. But something adjacent to it. Wagons this way, he said. They rode 14 miles in a silence that was neither comfortable nor hostile. It was just silence. The silence of 2 strangers who hadn't yet figured out how much the other person talked and didn't want to overcorrect in either direction. Lydia watched the land. It was nothing like the newspaper descriptions she'd read of the West. Nothing romantic, nothing cinematic. It was just land, mile after mile of it, rough grass and low hills and the occasional dark line of trees following a creek bed, all of it under a sky that felt lower and more immediate than the sky she'd grown up under. There was a wind that didn't stop, not once in 14 miles, and by the time the wagon turned down a rutted track toward a cluster of buildings, she could feel it in her teeth. This is it, Caleb said. The house was 2 stories, timber frame with a porch that ran across the front. It was not charming. He had not been lying when he said it needed work. One of the porch boards was visibly rotted, 2 windows on the upper floor had been boarded over from the inside, and the front door was hanging at a slight angle that suggested the frame had shifted. But it was standing, it was solid. The roof looked sound. Lydia had learned in the past 3 weeks that her standards had changed dramatically. It's good bones, she said. Caleb glanced at her. That's one way to put it. I meant it. I know you did. He climbed down from the wagon and held out a hand to help her. She took it. His grip was dry and matter-of-fact, and he released it the moment she had her footing, which she appreciated more than she could have explained. Ellis, the hired hand, was a lean, weathered man somewhere in his 50s who assessed her in about 4 seconds from across the yard and then went back to whatever he'd been doing with a fence post, which she later understood was his highest form of acceptance. The inside of the house was better than the outside and worse than she'd hoped. Clean, but spare. The particular cleanliness of a space that had been maintained without any real interest in it. The kitchen had a wood stove and a good table. The front room had 2 chairs and a fireplace and a rug that was worn nearly through in the middle. There were dishes in the cabinet and a reasonable supply of dry goods and a water pump just outside the back door that worked, though you had to prime it. Caleb showed her through each room with the efficiency of a man presenting inventory. He slept upstairs, he told her. There was a second bedroom she could have. The privy was 40 feet out the back, and there was a washroom off the kitchen. "I want to be clear about something," he said, when they were standing in the kitchen and he'd run out of practical things to point at. "All right," she said. "I don't know you. You don't know me." He was looking somewhere past her left shoulder, like a man who said necessary things by not looking directly at the person he was saying them to. "I'm not going to pretend otherwise. The advertisement, this arrangement, it's practical. I need help with this place, and I can't give you a regular life, and you're evidently not looking for one. But that doesn't mean—" He stopped. "Doesn't mean what?" "It doesn't mean I'll expect things of you that you haven't agreed to." He finally looked at her directly. "I want to be clear about that." Lydia held his gaze for a moment. She thought about Harold. She thought about the pen tapping twice against the paper. "I appreciate you saying that," she said. He nodded once, like a period at the end of a sentence, and went back outside. She stood in the kitchen alone and let out a long, slow breath. It wasn't safety. She wasn't naive enough to call it that yet. But it was something. It was space. Room to stand up straight without someone trying to cut her down. She looked around the kitchen, found a broom in the corner, swept the floor. Not because it needed it desperately, but because she needed something to do with her hands. She'd figure out the rest. The first week nearly broke her. She would not admit this to Caleb, or to Ellis, or to anyone, but she lay awake in that second bedroom on the third night with every muscle in her body screaming and her hands raw from work she hadn't known existed, and a list in her head of every single thing she didn't know how to do, and it was so long she had to stop counting. She didn't know how to build a fire that stayed lit. She learned, through trial and considerable smoke, but it took her until day 4 to do it reliably. She didn't know how much to feed the chickens. She found out by getting it wrong twice. She burned the first 3 breakfasts she attempted. Caleb ate them without comment, which she found simultaneously kind and maddening. On day 5, Ellis found her in the barn, attempting to figure out how the milk pails were meant to be hung, and stood there for a moment before saying, without inflection, "You're overthinking it." "I know," she said. "Try it and fix it if it's wrong." She looked at him. "Is that your general philosophy?" "General? Specific? All of it," he said, and walked out. She hung the pails the way she thought they should go, and fixed it once, and after that, it was fine. The town of Copperfield received her with the particular coldness of a community that had already decided what she was before she arrived. She went with Caleb on the supply run at the end of her first week, partly because she needed to understand where things were, and partly because she was going quietly stir-crazy at the ranch. The town was small. One main street, the usual arrangement of general store and bank and saloon, and the church at the end of the road. And the people in it were not precisely unfriendly, but there was something careful about the way they looked at her. She knew what it was. She'd heard the term before she left the city. Mail-order bride. The way some people said it, it was a kindness and a judgment at once, like calling something charming when you meant small and shabby. At the general store, the woman behind the counter, mid-40s, sharp eyes, hair pinned so tight it looked like it was causing pain, smiled at Lydia with the particular smile people deploy when they mean the opposite. "So you're the new Mrs. Mercer," she said. "Miss Rowan," Lydia said pleasantly. "We're not married yet." The woman's smile didn't waver, but her eyes recalibrated. "Well, we'll see how long you last." It wasn't said viciously. That was almost worse. It was said practically, like a prediction about weather. Lydia bought what she needed and said thank you and walked back to the wagon, and she sat with that sentence, "We'll see how long you last," the whole 14 miles home, turning it over in her hands like something she was deciding whether to keep or throw away. She decided to keep it. She was going to need the anger later. Victor Holloway introduced himself on a Thursday afternoon. She was in the yard when his horse came up the track, a large, well-fed animal ridden by a large, well-fed man in his 50s who wore his prosperity the way some men wear suits, consciously, as a statement. He had a pleasant face that she distrusted immediately and a voice that was warm in the way fires are warm, useful but not to be touched. "You must be the new bride," he said, not dismounting. "Still just Miss Rowan," she said. He smiled. "Caleb around?" "He's in the north pasture. I'll tell him you came by." Holloway looked around the yard slowly, unhurried, with the ease of a man who felt entitled to look at whatever he wanted for as long as he wanted. His gaze moved over the house, the outbuildings, the line of the fence, not looking at her, looking at the property. "Fine place," he said finally. "Mercer's had it 30 years, his father before him." He glanced back at her. "Shame to see it struggling." "It's not struggling," she said. Something shifted in his expression, slight, controlled, but there. A recalibration, the same as the woman in the store, but more deliberate. "Of course," he said. "I'm sure you'll be a great help." The warmth in his voice hadn't changed at all. "Tell Caleb I stopped by." He turned the horse and rode back down the track without hurrying. Lydia stood in the yard and watched him go, and she felt something she hadn't expected. Not fear, not even anger, but the cold, clarifying sensation of recognizing something for what it was. She'd grown up in a house where she'd watched her uncle smile at her parents across dinner tables for years. She knew that particular warmth. She knew what it was covering. When Caleb came in from the pasture at dusk, she told him about the visit immediately, in full, without softening any part of it. He listened standing up, still in his coat, and when she finished there was a silence that went about 4 seconds too long. "He's been after this land since my father was alive," Caleb said finally. "What does he want with it?" Caleb's jaw tightened. "Water," he said. "There's a source on this property, underground. Ellis found signs of it 3 years back. If Holloway gets this land, he controls the water supply for half the valley." Lydia thought about the way Holloway's eyes had moved across the property, not seeing a ranch at all, seeing an asset. "He's going to try to take it," she said. "He's been trying," Caleb said, "just more carefully before." She looked at him. "And now?" Caleb looked back. His expression was difficult to read, tired maybe and honest in the way people are honest when they've run out of energy to be anything else. "I don't know," he said. "Things feel different lately." Lydia thought about her uncle's hand coming down on that table. Sign it. The certainty of a man who had already decided the outcome before the conversation began. She knew this feeling. She'd sat across a table from this feeling 11 days after her parents were in the ground, and she'd looked it straight in the eye and mailed a letter to a stranger in Montana instead. "We're going to need to start writing things down," she said. Caleb looked at her. "Every visit, every conversation, every threat, even the ones that don't sound like threats yet." She crossed her arms. "If he's building a case against this ranch, we need to build one too." A long moment. "You've dealt with something like this before," Caleb said. "Not a question." "Something like it," she said. He nodded slowly, the way he nodded when he'd processed something and decided it was sound. "All right," he said. "It wasn't a partnership yet, not really. They were still too new with each other, still too careful, still circling the edges of what this arrangement between them was going to become. But it was a beginning." Outside, the wind pushed hard against the house, and the old walls shuddered once and held. The notebook was her idea, and Caleb thought it was a strange one until the 3rd week, when it stopped being strange. She'd found it in a drawer, a plain composition book, half the pages already used on one side with what looked like cattle counts and feed estimates in Caleb's uneven handwriting. She turned it over, started from the back, and began writing dates and descriptions in her small, careful script. October 14th. Victor Holloway, unannounced. Arrived midday, did not dismount. Asked for Caleb by name, surveyed yard and outbuildings without invitation. Mentioned the ranch was struggling, left without hostility but without apology for the assumption. She showed it to Caleb that evening. He read it twice, which she was already learning was something he did with things that mattered to him. "You write like a lawyer," he said. "My father was one," she said. "For a while." He looked up at her. She hadn't mentioned her father before, not in any detail, and the look on his face wasn't prying. It was just the recognition that a door had opened that hadn't been opened before. He said. He died in April, my mother 3 weeks after. She said it flat, the way you say things you've had to say too many times in too short a period. The house was in both their names and the estate went sideways, and my uncle, she stopped. It doesn't matter now. The point is, I know what it looks like when someone is building toward something. My uncle smiled at my parents for 15 years before he made his move. Caleb set the notebook down on the table between them. Holloway's been smiling at this ranch for longer than that, he said. Then we need to be further ahead of him than my parents were ahead of my uncle. There was a pause. Outside, something metallic was knocking in the wind. A gate latch, probably. Something else on the long list of things that needed fixing. I'll look at the property documents this weekend, Caleb said. There are survey maps in the back room. My father kept everything. Good. She pulled the notebook back toward her. Then we start there. It wasn't the moment they became partners. That would take longer and cost more than either of them anticipated. But it was the moment they both stopped pretending this was a simple arrangement between two people who needed different things from each other. It was more complicated than that. It was going to require more from both of them than they'd planned on giving. Neither of them said so out loud, but they both knew it. November arrived the way people in town had warned her it would, which was to say, it arrived like a wall. She had thought she understood cold. She'd lived through eastern winters, walked to school in snow, shivered in poorly heated rooms. But Montana cold was a different category of experience entirely. It wasn't just temperature. It was pressure, weight, something that pushed against the house from all sides simultaneously and found every gap between boards, every poorly sealed window frame, every draft that she'd barely noticed in October and now tracked with obsessive attention. She spent the first week of November recalking every window she could reach. Caleb watched her do it the first afternoon and then handed her a better tool without comment, and went back to his own work. And she understood that was his version of approval. She was learning his language. It was largely a language of silences and practical gestures, and the occasional sentence that did more work than it seemed to. He wasn't a cold man. She'd been bracing for cold and found instead someone more like a locked room. Not empty, just not easily opened. Ellis was easier in some ways. Ellis talked while he worked, a running low-level commentary on everything from the temperament of particular cattle to the structural soundness of fence posts to the history of various Copperfield residents, all delivered in the same flat, unhurried tone, regardless of the content. She learned more about the valley from Ellis in 2 weeks than she'd gathered from anyone else, including Caleb. Holloway buy up the Fenton place last spring? She asked one afternoon while they were mending a section of fence line that had buckled under an early frost. Ellis didn't look up from the wire. That's the third parcel in 4 years. Yep. All on the eastern side of the valley. Ellis straightened up then, looked at her with something that wasn't quite surprise but was adjacent to it. You've been looking at the maps. Caleb showed me the survey documents. A pause. Ellis worked a length of wire through a post bracket. Eastern parcels all sit above the main aquifer line, he said, like he was reporting the weather. If you owned that whole eastern flank and the Mercer land, you'd control everything downstream, she said. Everything. He pulled the wire taut. Every farm, every smaller ranch, every water source in the lower valley. Dry years especially. He glanced at her sideways. Had some bad dry years lately. She thought about that the rest of the afternoon. Thought about it through dinner and the dishes and the hours she spent in the front room afterward with the survey maps unfolded across the table, tracing the eastern boundary of Caleb's land with one finger. When Caleb came in from checking the barn and found her there, he stopped in the doorway. Ellis talked, she said, not looking up. Ellis always talks. He came to the table, looked at what she was looking at. You found the aquifer line. He controls everything east of this point, she said, touching the map. If he gets this ranch, he controls the water, Caleb said. Yeah, I know. Does your lawyer know? A silence, longer than usual. I don't have a lawyer, Caleb said. She looked up at him. Couldn't afford one after the cattle sickness 2 years back, he said. The words came out tight, like they'd been stored somewhere uncomfortable. Lost a third of the herd. It took everything I had just to keep the land in my name. She held his gaze. He didn't look away, which she'd learned meant he was saying something he didn't say easily. Holloway knows that, she said. Holloway's known my financial situation since before I did, he said. He has people in the bank. The coldness that moved through her then had nothing to do with the temperature. It was the same feeling she'd had sitting at her parents' dining room table, the feeling of discovering that the danger had been much closer, much longer standing, and much more deliberate than she'd understood. How long before the next property tax payment? She said. March. And if you can't make it? His jaw tightened. Then the county puts a lien on the property, and Holloway has people there too. She straightened up, folded the map along its original creases, which required patience because the paper had been unfolded and refolded many times before and had opinions about how it wanted to lie. Then we have until March, she said, and we're going to need every day of it. Well, she threw out her first batch of bread, which was dense as a stone and tasted approximately the same. The second batch rose too fast and collapsed. The third was edible but only just, and she brought it to the table with the particular expression of someone presenting evidence at trial. Caleb ate 2 pieces. It's not bad, he said. It's not good either. It'll get better. Everything I do here keeps needing to get better, she said, not complainingly, just as a statement of fact. He looked at her for a moment. You've been here 6 weeks. I know how long I've been here. When I took over this ranch from my father, I burned the first 4 meals I tried to make on that stove. Ellis ate them all, didn't say a word. She glanced at Ellis, who was methodically working through his bread without any detectable opinion about it. The stove runs hot on the left side, Ellis said, without looking up. Always has. You have to account for it. She stared at him. You could have mentioned that 6 weeks ago. You didn't ask. She opened her mouth and closed it again, and Caleb made a sound that might, under different circumstances, have been the beginning of a laugh. It didn't fully develop, but it was there. She filed that away, added it to the small accumulating catalog of Caleb Mercer she was building. Not deliberately, but the way you build understanding of anything you live alongside. He laughed quietly, when he laughed at all. He worked longer hours than anyone she'd ever met and complained about none of them. He had a habit of standing in doorways when he was thinking, like he needed the frame around him. He kept his father's tools hanging on the barn wall in the same arrangement his father had left them, and she suspected this was not about practicality. He had not asked her anything personal since the night she'd mentioned her father. Whether this was consideration or his own reticence, she couldn't be sure. Probably both. She asked him one evening about his wife. She hadn't planned to. They were in the kitchen. She was washing dishes. He was at the table going over something she didn't ask about. And the question came out in a quieter moment, when the silence between them had reached the specific quality she was beginning to recognize as comfortable. The advertisement said widower, she said. He didn't answer immediately. She heard him set down his pen. Margaret, he said. 3 years ago. Fever, then pneumonia. It went fast. I'm sorry. Yeah. A pause. She would have liked that you argued with Ellis about the stove. Lydia looked down at the dish in her hands. It was an unexpected thing for him to say, and she could tell from his voice that it had surprised him slightly too. What was she like? Lydia said. Stubborn, he said. Patient in some ways, not in others. She hated the winters and loved the springs. Another pause. She was good at this place. Lydia finished the dishes and dried her hands and didn't push further because she recognized the particular kind of quiet that follows a name being said out loud that doesn't often get said. But she thought about it, about what it meant that he'd compared her, however briefly, to someone he'd loved. Not as a replacement. The comparison wasn't that kind of thing. More like recognition. The recognition that the particular quality of stubbornness and fortitude he'd known before was something he'd put in an advertisement and hoped to find again without quite admitting that was what he was looking for. She didn't know how she felt about that. She went to bed without figuring it out. The incident at the feed store happened on a Wednesday in late November, and it was the moment Copperfield stopped being simply unfriendly and started being something more pointed. She'd gone alone. Caleb was dealing with a fence collapse on the north end, Ellis with him, and she'd taken the wagon herself for the first time, which she was quietly proud of, though the 14 miles had included one wrong turn she'd had to reverse out of, and a section of road that was more frozen mud than road and had required her to stop and think carefully about her wheel positioning. The feed store was run by a man named Grady, heavyset, 50s, with the permanently aggrieved expression of someone who felt the world owed him more than it was paying. He was not outwardly rude to her. He was something worse, elaborately unhelpful in a way she couldn't quite directly challenge. "Order for Mercer," she said. "Should be ready." He made a show of looking through papers on his counter. A long show. She waited. "Don't see it." "He placed it last week. I can tell you what was on it." "Don't see it," he said again, pleasantly, in a way that suggested seeing it was not something he intended to pursue. There were two other men in the store. She was aware of them in her peripheral vision, not approaching, not threatening, just present and watching with the particular quality of attention that is designed to make you feel watched. "Then I'll place a new order," she said. Grady took his time finding the order form, took his time recording her items, asked her to repeat several things twice when she was clear the first time. She kept her voice even and her face neutral, and she made sure every word she said was exactly correct, so he could find no fault with it. By the time she left, her jaw ached from holding it set. Outside, loading the partial supplies she'd managed to secure, a woman appeared at her elbow, younger than most of the people she'd encountered in town, maybe 30, with a direct gaze and the boots of someone who worked outdoors. "Don't let Grady bother you," the woman said, low. "He does that to anyone Holloway tells him to." Lydia looked at her. "Clara Finch," the woman said. "My husband has the farm 2 miles east of your place." She held out a hand. "And Grady's been Holloway's ear in this town for years. He's not going to make anything easy for the Mercer Ranch while Holloway's pushing." "Is everyone here working for Holloway?" "No," Clara said. "But enough people owe him enough favors that it amounts to the same thing sometimes." She picked up one of the feed sacks without being asked and loaded it onto the wagon. "You staying?" The question had weight to it, not unkind, just direct. "I'm staying," Lydia said. Clara looked at her for a moment with the particular appraisal of a woman who had learned to assess quickly. Then she nodded once, the same way Caleb nodded when he'd decided something was sound. "Good," she said. "Come by for coffee sometime. I have 2 kids and not enough adult conversation." It was the first genuinely uncalculated kindness Lydia had received in Copperfield, and she felt it the whole way home. Not overwhelming, but warm, like a coal banked against the cold. December came, and with it the first of what she would later think of as Holloway's quiet moves. The water on the east side of the property began running low. Not obviously, not dramatically. Just a gradual reduction in flow from the creek that fed the eastern livestock troughs. The kind of change that could be natural, could be seasonal, except Ellis said it wasn't seasonal, and he'd been watching this creek for 8 years. "Something's blocking it upstream," Ellis said. He had a habit of stating impossible conclusions in the same tone other people used to discuss lunch. "Blocking it how?" Lydia asked. "Diversion, maybe. Small one. You'd have to go up past the ridge to see." Caleb went up past the ridge the next morning and came back an hour later with his coat dark with mud and something in his face that she'd not seen before, not anger exactly, something quieter than anger and in some ways worse. "Someone dug a channel," he said, "about 300 yards up, runs maybe 10% of the flow off to the east." "Holloway's side," she said. "His land is close enough up there." He pulled off his boots at the door. "I can't prove it was him." "Can we fill it in?" "I already did, but—" He stopped. "But he can dig it again," she said. "Yeah." She wrote it in the notebook that evening. December 4th, creek diversion discovered on East Branch, approximately 300 yards north of property boundary. Filled in. Origin unclear, but directional evidence suggests deliberate act. This is the 3rd entry in the notebook about Holloway's activities, and she'd begun numbering them. She showed the entry to Caleb. "We need to photograph this if it happens again," she said. "Document it physically, not just in writing." He looked at her. "Where are you going to get a camera out here?" "Clara Finch's husband might have one. I'll ask." He looked at her in that way he sometimes did. Not surprised, but something adjacent to it, like he was perpetually slightly revising his understanding of who she was. She was beginning to find it less unnerving and more interesting. "All right," he said. Thomas Finch did have a camera. It was old and required patience and produced results that were more shadow than image half the time. But Lydia practiced with it on 3 consecutive afternoons until she understood its limitations well enough to work within them. She was adding a new skill to the list roughly every week now. The list of things she didn't know how to do was still longer than she'd like, but it was shrinking. The Christmas season in Copperfield was celebrated with a church gathering she and Caleb attended out of social necessity. It was, as Clara had warned her, the kind of event where your absence was noted and interpreted. She wore the better of her two dresses and sat beside Caleb in the third row and nodded pleasantly at people who had shown her varying degrees of warmth and indifference in the past 2 months. Victor Holloway sat 4 rows ahead. He turned at some point during the gathering and found her eyes across the room, and he smiled at her the way he always smiled, warm, deliberate, giving away nothing except the fact that there was something behind it he wasn't giving away. She smiled back with equal precision and looked away first, which was a choice. After, in the crowd of people milling around in coats and scarves outside in the gray December afternoon, he worked his way toward them with the unhurried ease of a man who'd never had to push through a crowd in his life. People simply moved for him, which told you something. Caleb, a handshake, firm and brief. Then his attention moved to her. "Miss Rowan, how are you finding Montana?" "Cold," she said. "Beautiful." "That about covers it." His smile didn't waver. "You're settling in well, I hear." She wondered what he'd heard, and from whom. "We're doing fine," she said. "Glad to hear it." He glanced at Caleb. "I hope the water situation on the East Branch sorted itself out." The pause was barely a pause. Half a second. But it was there. Caleb's voice, when it came, was perfectly level. "It did. Thank you for asking." "Good, good." Holloway nodded. "These things happen. Water finds its own way, doesn't it?" He said it with this comfortable certainty of a man making a point. He didn't need to emphasize, because the point was already understood by everyone present. He moved on. Other people to speak to. He was that kind of man, always moving, always present, never still long enough for you to quite get a fix on him. Lydia watched him go. "He knew," she said very quietly. "He knew," Caleb said, equally quiet. She reached into her coat pocket without thinking, and her fingers found the small notebook she'd started carrying with her. It was habit now, the instinct to record. "He's testing us," she said, "seeing if we'll push back." "What do we do?" She looked up at Caleb. He was watching Holloway across the crowd with an expression she could finally read. Not fear, not defeat. Just the honest tiredness of a man who'd been dealing with this for years and hadn't had anyone to deal with it alongside him. Until now. "We push back," she said, carefully, on paper, in a way that holds up. He nodded. Then, after a moment, "The tax payment. I've been working numbers. If the cattle prices hold through February, tell me tonight," she said. "All of it, every number." He looked at her with that look again, the revision look. Then, "Yeah, all right." They walked back to the wagon in the thin gray December light, and she was aware, not sentimentally, but practically, and with some precision, that the thing between them was becoming something neither of them had advertised for. Not love. Not yet. And maybe not in the form either of them had experience with. But something built from the same material as trust, laid down the same way you lay down good foundation. Not quickly, not romantically, but board by board, weight-tested, in full awareness of what the structure needed to hold. January was the month. Holloway stopped being quiet. It started with the fence. A 300-yard section of the south boundary had been cut, cleanly, deliberately, in the night, the wire ends bent back with the kind of precision that was its own message. Cattle had drifted through into the adjacent unfenced land, and it took most of a morning to recover them, with Ellis on horseback and Lydia on foot because she was faster through the scrub on the ground than mounted, which she discovered was one of the useful side effects of having grown up walking everywhere. It took all day to repair the fence. She worked alongside Ellis and Caleb without being asked, because asking would have been an insult to the obvious need. And by the time they finished, her hands were in a condition she'd thought only Ellis's hands ever reached. That evening, she wrote the entry in the notebook, and then she pulled out the survey maps and looked at the south boundary line and thought about what cutting that particular section of fence accomplished beyond disruption. If cattle drifted far enough south, she said, when Caleb came in, would they cross onto Holloway's land? He thought about it. Possibly. And if they did, would he have any legal claim to them? A longer pause. Stray livestock law is complicated here. What does complicated mean? It means Holloway's brother-in-law is the county magistrate. She wrote that down too, in different words, but the same precise language her father had used when documenting things that might later need to be explained to someone who hadn't been there. The next morning, she asked Caleb if she could take the wagon to Copperfield. He looked at her. "You need something from town?" "I need to send a letter," she said, "to a lawyer in Helena. I want to find out if there are any attorneys who handle property and water rights disputes in this county who aren't already connected to Holloway." The silence that followed was careful. "That costs money," he said. "I know." She held his gaze. "An initial consultation letter costs a stamp and time. We can decide what comes after based on the answer." He thought for a moment. That two-beat silence she'd learned preceded agreement when he'd already decided but wanted to confirm it against something internal. "All right," he said. She wrote the letter that morning, in the composition book first as a draft, then copied onto proper writing paper in her most careful hand. She explained the situation without embellishment, the way her father had taught her. State the facts, name the parties, describe the pattern. Let the facts carry the weight. She mailed it that afternoon and came home and cooked a dinner that was, for the first time since she'd arrived in Montana, genuinely good. The stove's hot left side finally mapped fully in her understanding, the proportions right, the timing right. Caleb ate 2 helpings. He didn't say anything about the food specifically, but he looked up once in the middle of the meal with an expression she'd only seen a few times on his face. Something unguarded, something that existed for a moment before he organized it back behind the usual quiet. Ellis looked up from his plate and looked at Caleb and then at Lydia and then back at his plate with the specific intentional obtuseness of a man who saw exactly what he was pretending not to see. "The stove cooperated," Lydia said, to no one in particular. "About time," Ellis said. Outside the wind was building again, that relentless Montana wind pressing against the old house from every side. But the walls held. The fire in the hearth was steady. The notebook on the shelf by the door had 14 entries now, each one dated and precise, each one a brick in something she was building with the same deliberate care she'd learned to apply to every other task on this ranch. She didn't know yet what the building would look like when it was finished, but she was learning, slowly, imperfectly, with burned bread and aching hands and the quiet accumulation of days, that she was exactly the person to finish it. The letter from Helena came back in 3 weeks. The attorney's name was Silas Drummond, and his reply was 3 pages, which was more than she'd expected and cost him more time than a stranger's letter generally warranted, which told her something about either his character or his interest in the case. Probably both. He wrote in dense, careful sentences that reminded her of her father's speech on good days, when the law was something he loved rather than something that wore him down. The news was not entirely bad, and not entirely good, which was about what she'd hoped for. The property rights themselves were sound. The Mercer land had been properly surveyed and registered in 1861, and the chain of title was clean. The water rights, however, were a different matter. Montana water law in this period was a moving target, Drummond wrote, and the underground aquifer beneath the eastern section of the Mercer property had never been formally registered as a separate water right. It existed. The geological evidence Ellis had found 3 years earlier was apparently not unique knowledge. Other surveys had noted the formation, but the formal legal claim had never been filed, which meant that if someone else filed it first, the legal picture became complicated in ways that favored whoever had more money to spend on lawyers. She read the letter twice, then handed it to Caleb without comment. He read it standing up, the way he read most things that mattered. When he finished, he set it on the table and put both hands flat on the surface and looked at the wall for a moment. "He's going to try to file on the water," Caleb said, "before us." "Drummond thinks it's possible he already has the paperwork drafted," she said. "The question is whether he's filed it yet." "How do we find out?" "County Records Office," she said. "In Mill Haven. That's the county seat. That's 40 miles. I know." He looked at her. She looked back. "I'll go Thursday," he said. "We'll go Thursday," she said. "I know what to look for." He didn't argue, which she took as evidence that the weeks of working alongside each other had established something. Not dominance, not deference, but the specific working trust that develops between people who've watched each other handle difficult things and updated their understanding accordingly. The road to Mill Haven was worse than the road to Copperfield in every measurable sense. 3 hours by wagon on a February morning that started at 12 degrees and rose to 20 by the time they arrived, which was technically an improvement and felt like none. Lydia wore every layer she owned in a configuration she'd developed through trial and the specific education of having been genuinely, dangerously cold several times since October. Caleb drove. She sat beside him on the wagon bench with the notebook in her coat pocket and Drummond's letter folded inside the notebook, and her father's legal instincts arranged, as best she could arrange them, in her mind. They didn't talk much on the way. That had become comfortable between them, the shared quiet of two people who'd learned that silence didn't require filling. Somewhere around the second hour, with the valley spread out to the south in the pale winter light, he said, without preamble, "My father built that barn in 1873. Took him and two neighbors 11 days. I was 4. I mostly remember the smell of the lumber and my mother bringing food out every few hours." She looked at him. "I'm not going to lose it," he said. Not dramatically. Just a statement, the same way Ellis stated things, flatly, with the full weight of meaning behind the flatness. "No," she said. "You're not." He nodded once, and the silence resumed, and it felt different now. Not lighter exactly, but more settled, like something had been named that didn't need to be named again. The county records office was in a building on Mill Haven's Main Street that smelled of paper and coal heat and a decades-deep accumulation of ink. The clerk was a thin young man who looked at them with the mild wariness of someone accustomed to people arriving in states of agitation and finding the records they'd hoped wouldn't exist. Lydia asked for the water rights filings for the past 18 months. The clerk disappeared, came back with a bound ledger that was heavier than it looked. She went through it at the records table with Caleb standing beside her, both of them in their coats because the room was heated nominally at best. She read each entry with the focus she'd learned from watching her father work. Not skimming, not hoping, just reading each line for what it actually said. She found it on page 47. November 29th. A water rights claim, filed under a holding company name, Clearwater Valley Properties, for the underground aquifer formation in sections 14 and 15 of the Eastern Valley. The legal description was precise, detailed, the work of someone who'd paid a good lawyer. The sections described were adjacent to the Mercer property's eastern boundary. Adjacent. Not on it. Not yet. She read it twice. "He filed it in November," she said. Caleb looked at where her finger was on the page. His jaw tightened, but his voice stayed controlled. "Clearwater Valley Properties. That's his company. It has to be." She was already turning back through earlier pages. "If he filed a claim on those sections, he's positioning," Caleb said. "Those sections don't touch our aquifer directly. They're adjacent. But if he can establish that his claim encompasses the primary source..." She stopped. Found another entry, 6 pages earlier. October 3rd. A survey filing. Same holding company. The language described a hydrological study of the Eastern Valley water formation, establishing Clearwater Valley Properties as the party of record for future development claims. He'd filed the survey before he'd filed the rights claim. He'd been building the legal foundation stone by stone, the same way he'd been building everything else. And October 3rd was 11 days before Holloway had shown up at the ranch on a Thursday afternoon, not dismounting, looking at the property with those measuring eyes. He'd filed the paperwork, and then he'd come to look at what he was planning to take. She wrote down both filing dates, both company names, both legal descriptions, in the notebook with her most careful handwriting. Then she asked the clerk politely for copies, which took another 40 minutes and cost 50 cents and was worth every moment and every penny. On the wagon ride back, with the copied documents folded in the notebook and the notebook in her pocket and her hand resting on top of it through her coat because she needed to feel it was there, she said, "He's done this before." Caleb glanced at her. "Not just here," she said. "This is too practiced. The holding company, the survey filed first, the rights claim second, the adjacency strategy. This is someone who's done this in other places and knows exactly how to make it look like a legal process instead of a theft." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "You think there are other properties?" "I think there are other people who signed documents like the one my uncle put in front of me," she said, "because they didn't understand what they were looking at, or because they couldn't afford to fight it, or because someone made things uncomfortable enough for long enough that walking away seemed like the easier choice. The road turned and the wind picked up, pushing against them from the north. "We're riding to Drummond tonight," she said. "Yeah," Caleb said. Drummond came to Copperfield in March. He was not what she'd pictured. She had imagined someone imposing, lawyerly, sharp-edged, the kind of professional presence that filled a room. Instead, she got a short, round man in his late 60s who arrived on the stagecoach with a battered leather case and a cough he'd apparently had for years and made no effort to suppress. He wore spectacles with one slightly bent arm and a coat that had been good once, maybe 15 years ago. But he read the notebook from the first entry to the last without stopping, and when he finished, he looked up at her over his spectacles and said, "You wrote all of this?" "Yes." "In this order? Contemporaneously?" "From the first week," she said. He looked at Caleb. "She's better than most witnesses I've worked with." "She's better than most people I've worked with," Caleb said. It was the most direct compliment he'd ever paid her. She felt it somewhere behind her sternum and didn't let it show on her face. Drummond spread the copied records from Mill Haven on the kitchen table and studied them alongside a map of the valley that Ellis had produced from memory and Lydia had corrected against the survey documents. The picture it made was not subtle once you knew how to read it. "Clearwater Valley Properties," Drummond said, tapping the holding company name. "I've seen this name before. Not here. A case in Wyoming, 4 years ago. Different location, same structure. A rancher named Purcell lost a water dispute and eventually sold under pressure." He looked at her. "I never had documentation like this on that case." "Can we use it?" she said. "Some of it, yes. The diversion on the creek. That's trespass and interference with water flow, potentially actionable. The fence cutting is harder. The survey filings," he paused. "The filings are legal. Filing isn't theft. But if we can demonstrate a pattern of deliberate interference concurrent with the filing activity—" "I can show you the dates," she said. She pulled the notebook back and laid it open to a specific page where she'd drawn a timeline. Date of each Holloway action on the left, date of each county filing on the right. The parallel columns spoke clearly. Drummond looked at it for a long moment. "Good Lord," he said quietly. "Can we file a counterclaim on the water rights?" she said. "The aquifer under our properties, is it too late?" "It's not too late if we move quickly," he said. "The primary source formation sits under your land, not his. His claim is on adjacent sections. If we establish prior use and formal registration—" He was already thinking past the sentence. "It'll be contested. He'll bring his own attorneys and they'll be better paid than I am." "How much?" Caleb said. The number Drummond gave was not small. Caleb's face didn't change, but something in his posture did. A tightening, almost imperceptible. Lydia did the arithmetic she'd been doing in her head for weeks. The cattle prices, the spring sales, what was left from winter operations, the cost of the March tax payment which they'd made, barely, in February. She knew his finances now almost as well as he did. He'd shared everything that first night she'd asked him to, and she'd kept track of it since with the same systematic attention she gave to everything she couldn't afford to let slip. "If we defer the north fence repair until May and sell the January calves early," she began. "We could cover the retainer," Caleb said. He'd done the same arithmetic, apparently, and arrived at the same place. Drummond looked between them. "When did you two get married?" "We haven't," Caleb said. "You should," Drummond said without inflection. "It simplifies the legal standing considerably. Right now, Miss Rowan has no formal standing on this property, and any claim she's made in this notebook is as a private citizen, not a party of interest." A silence settled over the kitchen that was different from their usual silences. This one had edges. She looked at the table. He looked at the table. "That's a practical consideration," she said carefully. "It is," Drummond agreed without apparent awareness that he'd just detonated something in the room. Drummond stayed 3 days, reviewing documents and writing the property with Ellis and drawing up the initial filings he'd need to take back to Helena to process. He slept in what would eventually be the sitting room, on a cot Ellis produced from somewhere in the barn, and ate every meal at the kitchen table with the appetite of a man who didn't eat well when left to his own devices. On his last evening, after dinner, Caleb went to check the barn, and Drummond sat at the table with the notebook again, going through specific entries, And Lydia washed the dishes and didn't ask what he was thinking because she could see on his face that he was organizing something. "How did you know to document things this way?" he said, without looking up. "My father," she said. "He was a lawyer. Not a very successful one, in the end. He wasn't good at the parts that required being less than honest. But he showed me how a case is built, how evidence works, how a single detail doesn't mean anything, but a pattern of details is a story that holds up." Drummond turned a page. "What happened to him?" "He died," she said, "and then his estate went to someone who had been waiting a long time for it." He looked up at that. "Yes," he said. "I see." He went back to the notebook, and she went back to the dishes, and neither of them said anything further, but she felt the weight of his understanding in the room and found it oddly steadying. The feeling of being seen accurately, without either pity or performance, was something she'd had so rarely in the past year that she'd almost forgotten it was possible. The question Drummond had raised, deliberately or not, sat in the house after he left the way certain questions do, quietly, not going anywhere, present in the corners of ordinary interactions. She and Caleb worked around it for 4 days, which was, she recognized, itself a kind of answer. That it was possible to work around it meant it had some weight. On the 5th evening, he came in from the south pasture later than usual, in the dark, tracking mud. She'd have to clean off the floor, and she was at the table with the legal documents Drummond had left copies of, going through them for the 3rd time because there was one clause in the counterfiling description she wanted to be sure she understood. He poured himself water and stood at the kitchen counter and didn't speak for a moment. "I need to say something," he said. She looked up. "About what Drummond said." He was looking at the counter, not at her. "About the legal standing." "I know what he said." "I'm not asking because of the legal standing," he said. "I want to be clear about that." He finally looked at her. "I'm asking because I think you know by now that this place needs you, not just—" He stopped, started again. "Not just as extra hands. I mean that I don't know how I was managing it before, and that's the truth." It was the most words she'd heard him say consecutively about anything that wasn't cattle or property or weather. She set down the document. "I'm not the same person I was when I answered that advertisement," she said carefully. "I came here because I had no other choice." "That's not a flattering reason." "No," he agreed. "And I put an ad in the paper because I couldn't figure out any other way to ask for help." "That's not a flattering reason either." A silence. Outside the wind, always the wind. "We've been honest with each other about most things," she said. "Yeah. I think we can be honest about this." She folded her hands on the table. "I don't know what I feel. I know that I trust you. I know that this place has started to feel like somewhere I belong, which is more than I can say for anywhere I've lived in the past year. I know that when I'm working alongside you, I feel—" She stopped, searching for the word that wasn't sentimental and wasn't false. "Useful, in a way that matters." He was quiet for a moment. "That's not nothing." "No, it's not nothing." She looked at him. "Is it enough to start with?" He thought about it the way he thought about most real things. Without rushing, without performing the thinking, just doing it. "For me it is," he said. She nodded. "Then let's be practical about it," she said, "and hope that practical becomes something more as we go." He almost smiled. Not quite, but the shape of it was there. "That's about the least romantic proposal I've ever heard," he said. "It's the only honest one I could make," she said. "I know," he said. "That's why it works." They married in April, in the Copperfield courthouse, with Ellis as witness and Clara Finch, who had become Lydia's closest approximation of a friend, as the second. The magistrate was not Holloway's brother-in-law. They'd checked and arranged the date accordingly. The ceremony took 11 minutes. Clara cried, which she appeared to find embarrassing. Ellis did not cry, but he shook Caleb's hand for slightly longer than necessary and then shook Lydia's hand with a formality that was its own kind of sentiment. Afterward, they went to Clara's house for coffee and pie because Clara had insisted on it, and Lydia sat at Clara's kitchen table and watched Caleb talk with Thomas Finch in the way men talk when they're at ease, slowly, with space between sentences, and she felt something she hadn't felt in so long it took her a moment to identify it. Safe. Not permanently, not naively, But right now, in this moment, with these people, in this place she'd chosen. She held it for a few seconds and then set it aside, because there was still a legal case to build and a man who intended to take everything they had, and she couldn't afford to let the feeling make her soft. But she filed it away. Something to return to. Morsen. The deposition notice arrived in May. Drummond had warned them it was coming. Holloway's attorneys had responded to the counterfiling with the kind of aggressive procedural response that characterized expensive legal firms that were accustomed to burying smaller parties in paperwork. There were 3 separate motions filed within 2 weeks of Drummond's initial submission, each one raising a different technical objection to the water rights counterclaim. "He's trying to run up the clock and the cost," Drummond wrote in his accompanying letter. Hold firm. Holding firm was easier said than managed. The legal fees were already pressing against the edge of what they could sustain through spring cattle sales, and Holloway's attorneys had requested a formal deposition of all parties, which meant Caleb and Ellis and Lydia herself. The deposition was scheduled for June in Millhaven. She prepared for it the way she'd prepared for everything since arriving in Montana, methodically, without pretending she was more ready than she was, and without stopping. She wrote out every entry in the notebook in clean chronological order. She organized the copied county records by date. She wrote summaries of what each document established and what questions it might raise. She also wrote out for the first time a full account of the creek diversion she'd discovered in December. Not just the facts, but the subsequent events. Because the diversion had been filled in December, and in April it had been dug out again. And this time she'd had Thomas Finch's camera, and she'd used it, standing in mud to her ankles at 6 in the morning on a Tuesday, photographing the diverted channel with the care she'd practiced in Finch's yard. The photographs were not beautiful, but they were clear, and they were dated by the development records at the shop in Millhaven. When she brought the photographs to show Drummond at his next visit, he sat with them for a long moment in complete silence. "Where did you learn to document evidence?" he said. "I told you, my father." "Your father should have been at the bar longer," he said. "He should have been a lot of things longer," she said. "He wasn't, so I'll do it." "What?" It was Ellis who found the letters. He wasn't looking for them. He'd been cleaning out a rotted section of the barn floor, something he'd been meaning to do since the previous fall and had finally gotten to in late May. And beneath a section of old floorboard, wrapped in oilcloth that had kept them dry for years, was a wooden box. Inside the box were papers, property documents, survey records, and letters. Handwritten letters, dated between 1882 and 1889, between Caleb's father and a territorial land office official named Mercer, hadn't known personally, but had apparently corresponded with regarding the aquifer formation on the eastern section. The letters were extraordinary, not in their language. Caleb's father had been a plain writer, plainer than Caleb, which took some doing, but in their content. 3 of them referenced a formal conversation between the elder Mercer and a territorial land officer about registering the water formation as a property right attached to the ranch. One of them contained the officer's written response, confirming that the formation had been surveyed and verbally acknowledged as Mercer claim water, pending formal registration that had apparently never been completed because the territorial office had been reorganized in 1890 and the file had disappeared in the transition. She read them at the kitchen table while Ellis watched from the doorway, and Caleb stood behind her and none of them spoke. "This is prior claim evidence," she said. "This is verbal acknowledgement from a territorial official. If Drummond can establish that the formal registration was disrupted by administrative reorganization rather than abandoned, then the original claim survives," Caleb said. "It might." She looked up at him. "This might be enough to tip the balance." Ellis said nothing. He was leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed, and the expression he wore when something had gone the right way after a long time of going wrong. Not triumphant, just quietly satisfied, the way a man looks when a thing he's worked at for years finally settles into place. "Your father was trying to protect it," she said to Caleb. "He just ran out of time to finish the paperwork." Caleb looked at the letters for a long moment. He reached out and picked up the one with his father's handwriting on it. Not to read it, just to hold it. She watched him hold it and didn't say anything, because there are moments when silence is the correct response, and this was one of them. After a while, he set it back down carefully, like he was putting something back where it belonged. "Let's send these to Drummond tonight," he said. "I already made copies," she said. He looked at her. I started copying them the moment Ellis brought the box in, she said. The originals need to be stored somewhere safe, not in this house. Clara's, maybe. He stared at her for 3 full seconds. Lydia, he said. What? Nothing. He picked up his hat from the peg by the door. I'm going to check the cattle. Write the letter to Drummond. He went out. Ellis unfolded himself from the doorway and followed without comment. She sat alone at the kitchen table with the letters and her copies and the notebook and the organized stack of evidence that had been building since October. And she thought, for just a moment, about a girl who had sat at another kitchen table with a pen being pressed toward her hand, being told to sign and be grateful, with nothing to her name but $43 in her shoe and the terrifying open-ended freedom of refusal. Since then. Not alone. That was the part she hadn't expected when she'd mailed that first letter, that the loneliness she'd carried since her parents died would not be waiting for her in Montana, that it would, gradually, in the imperfect and unromantic and genuinely difficult way of real things, be replaced by something else. She picked up her pen and began the letter to Drummond. The enclosed documents were discovered today, she wrote. I believe they changed the legal picture substantially. I have made copies of each item. The originals will be stored separately. Please read them carefully before the June deposition and tell me what you need from us next. She sealed it, addressed it, and set it by the door for morning. Outside, the May wind was lighter than the winter wind, the kind of wind that suggested the season had turned for real, that the worst had passed, that the ground was capable of warmth again. She wasn't naive enough to think the fight was over. But for the first time since she'd arrived in Montana, they were no longer simply defending. They were moving forward. Drummond's response to the letters came faster than anything he'd sent before. 6 days, which was nearly return mail speed given the distance. And it was the most animated piece of writing she'd received from him, which was not saying a great deal because Drummond's emotional range on paper ran from measured to slightly less measured. But he used the word significant 3 times in 2 pages, which she was beginning to understand was his version of standing up and shouting. The territorial acknowledgement letters changed the legal foundation of the counterclaim. Not conclusively. Nothing in law was conclusive until a judge said so, and Drummond was careful to say that, but substantially. If the water formation had been verbally acknowledged as a Mercer water right by a territorial official in 1887, and if the formal registration had been interrupted by administrative reorganization rather than abandoned by the claimant, then the prior claim argument had genuine legal teeth. Holloway's October filing would be filing on contested ground, not open ground. That was a different case entirely. Bring the originals to the June deposition, Drummond wrote. Keep the copies elsewhere. Do not discuss this with anyone in Copperfield until we speak in person. She read that last line twice and understood it. Holloway had ears in Copperfield. She'd known that since December. Clara had said it plainly. Grady at the feed store, likely others she hadn't identified. Whatever advantage the letters gave them, it needed to stay an advantage. She told Caleb and Ellis and no one else. June arrived with this kind of heat that surprised her every time, even now. The Montana summer was not what she'd expected, fierce in a way that felt personally targeted after a winter that had felt the same. The valley turned green and then gold, and the work shifted with the season. Different problems, different hours, the particular exhaustion of long summer days that started before dawn and still weren't finished when the light finally gave out near 9. The deposition was scheduled for June 12th in Mill Haven. 2 days before it, the sabotage happened. She had stopped being surprised by Holloway's timing. He had a gift for it, a particular instinct for finding the moments when people were stretched thin and hitting them there. The deposition was 2 days out. Their attention and energy both pointed toward it. Caleb reviewing documents in the evenings rather than sleeping. Ellis covering extra work during the day to free up Caleb's time. And Lydia doing 3 people's worth of preparation while also managing what had become, without anyone declaring it, her full and non-negotiable role as the ranch's operational second-in-command. The sabotage was fire, or the attempt at it. Ellis smelled it first. He had the particular alertness of a man who'd spent decades sleeping light in bunkhouses where fire was the thing you feared above most others. It was 2 a.m, and she heard him moving before she heard anything else. His boots on the floorboards directly above the kitchen, then on the stairs, then out the front door without a word. She was up and dressed before Caleb registered that something was wrong. What Ellis had found was a small blaze at the base of the eastern barn wall. Not accidental, not the result of a kicked lantern or a poorly disposed ash. A deliberate pile of kindling and dry grass stacked against the oldest, driest timber section of the wall, lit and left to work its way up. The wind that night, fortunately, was light. It had been burning for less than 20 minutes. The wall was scorched, and one section of exterior timber had caught, but the fire hadn't gotten inside the barn wall itself. They put it out with bucket lines from the water trough, all three of them, Caleb and Ellis and Lydia, for 40 minutes in the dark. And by the time it was completely out, she couldn't feel her hands properly, and her eyes were streaming from the smoke. She wrote it in the notebook by lamplight while Caleb and Ellis walked the perimeter in the dark. She wrote the time, the location, the construction of the fire. Deliberate, she wrote, not accidental. Stacked material, accelerant smell on the grass, placed against the oldest wall section where spread was most likely. She wrote what the fire had not achieved and why. Light wind, early detection. When Caleb came back in, his face was black with smoke, and his expression had settled into something she hadn't seen often on him, a focused anger that was colder than the hot kind. Someone walked in from the east, he said. Ellis found tracks. Boot, man-sized, came from the creek direction. Holloway's property side, she said. Yeah. He knows the deposition is in 2 days, she said. Yeah. She looked at him. We can't prove it was his man. No. He pulled off his coat. Under it his shirt was damp, and he smelled of smoke and sweat, and the particular sourness of real fear that the body doesn't advertise but doesn't hide either. We're not going to be able to prove it. I know. She held up the notebook. But I'm going to write it down. He looked at her for a moment. Something in his face was very tired. Not the normal tired of physical work, but the tired of a man who has been fighting a long defensive battle for a very long time and has just watched the enemy walk up to his barn at 2 a.m. Lydia, he said. What? I need you to know. He stopped, started differently. When I put that advertisement in the paper, I was trying to solve a practical problem. I didn't have expectations about what kind of person would answer it. She waited. I didn't expect you, he said, and I want you to know that I understand what it cost you to come here, and that I don't take it lightly. He said this looking at the floor, which was his way with things he found difficult to say. That's all. She stood with the notebook in her hands and the smell of smoke in her hair and thought about a lot of things she could say and chose the most honest one. I know you don't, she said. Go to sleep. We have 2 days. He looked up at her then, and she saw in his face the thing she'd been watching build for months. Not the dramatic version, not the version from books, but the real version, which was quieter and more durable and more vulnerable than she'd known to expect. He nodded once and went upstairs, and she sat at the kitchen table until she was sure he was asleep, and then she cried a little, briefly, for no reason she could have clearly named except that she was very tired and the fire had frightened her more than she'd let show, and sometimes the weight of everything she was carrying needed somewhere to go. Then she dried her face and went to bed. The Millhaven deposition was 3 hours long, in a wood-paneled room above the county clerk's office that smelled of decades-old pipe smoke and the particular formality of legal proceedings. Holloway's attorneys were 2 men from Helena, young, expensive, precise. They had the practiced smoothness of people who were very good at making complicated things seem simple, and simple things seem complicated, depending on which outcome their client was paying for. Drummond sat beside her and Caleb and was, she was relieved to find, sharper in person than even his letters had suggested. His cough had not improved, but he seemed to breathe through it rather than be interrupted by it, which she found oddly reassuring. She gave her testimony calmly and thoroughly, the way she'd prepared to, with the notebook's contents organized in her memory so that she could answer each question with the specific detail that made it useful. When one of Holloway's attorneys challenged her documentation of the creek diversion, suggesting it could have been a natural channel variation, she produced the photographs. When he challenged the photographs as undated, Drummond produced the development receipt from the Millhaven shop. When the attorney pivoted to questioning her standing as a witness, Drummond produced the marriage certificate. Caleb's testimony was sparser but solid. He was, she'd come to understand, someone a judge or official would naturally trust. Not because he performed trustworthiness, but because his particular brand of plainness came across as exactly what it was. He didn't embellish. He didn't interpret. He stated what he'd seen and experienced and stopped. Ellis was the same, compressed into even fewer words, delivered with such absolute calm that the attorney, trying to rattle him, eventually gave up with a visible and almost sympathetic resignation. But the moment that mattered, the moment she felt it in the room, was when Drummond laid the 1887 letters on the table. Holloway's senior attorney read them, and she watched him read them, and she saw the point at which he understood what he was reading. His face didn't change significantly. Men who were paid very well to keep their faces still in difficult moments were good at exactly that. But there was a brief pause in his reading that was slightly too long, and a subsequent adjustment of his posture that was slightly too controlled. They hadn't expected the letters. Whatever preparation Holloway had made for this deposition, whoever his sources in Copperfield had been, they hadn't known about the letters because nobody outside the ranch and Drummond had known about the letters. For the first time in this entire fight, Holloway had been surprised. She looked at the table, did not allow herself to look satisfied, but she felt it, a clean, quiet certainty, like a level showing plumb. The attorneys requested an extension to review the newly submitted documents. The judge handling the case is a district court judge named Albright, who had the distracted, slightly aggrieved air of a man dealing with far too many disputes over the same general categories of problem. Granted 2 weeks. 2 weeks was not a victory, but it was a signal. If the letters had been easily dismissed, they wouldn't have needed 2 weeks to figure out how to dismiss them. Drummond stayed in Copperfield the night after the deposition at Clara's house because she'd insisted on it, and he sat at the Mercer kitchen table that evening with a whiskey he'd accepted from Caleb and the letters in front of him and something in his expression that wasn't quite hope, but was the professional equivalent of it. 40 years of practicing law, he said, and I have never had a client bring me this kind of documentation. Her father, Caleb said from across the table. I know. Drummond looked at her. You've done everything correctly. I want you to understand that. Whatever happens next, this case was built correctly. What does happen next, she said. They'll come back with one of two things, Drummond said. Either a challenge to the authenticity of the 1887 letters, which will fail because the paper and ink are period consistent and the territorial office records can be cross-referenced, or they'll propose a settlement. She looked at him. What kind of settlement? Holloway will want to save face. He may offer to withdraw the competing water claim in exchange for an easement, a legal right of access to a portion of the water for his eastern properties. And if we refuse? Then it goes to full trial, probably in the fall, which we can win, I believe, but which will cost more than settling and take longer. He turned his whiskey glass. That's the calculation. Caleb, she said. He'd been quiet for the last few minutes, looking at something in the middle of the table that wasn't actually there. What do you think? She said. I think he burned my barn, Caleb said, or he paid someone to. And he cut my fence and diverted my water and bought enough people in this county to make every step of this twice as hard as it should have been. He paused. I don't want to give him an easement. I don't want him to have a legal foothold on anything connected to this property. Drummond nodded slowly. Then we go to trial. Then we go to trial, Caleb said. Lydia looked at him. He looked back. It'll be expensive, she said. Not arguing, just making sure they were in the same place. Yeah, he said, we'll manage it. Yeah, he said again. And she could hear in that single syllable that he trusted her assessment of what they could manage, which was not a small thing coming from a man who'd handled this ranch's finances alone for years. Summer deepened and the legal case moved at the particular pace of legal things, slow, periodical, punctuated by flurries of correspondence, and then long silences. They worked the ranch through July and August with the additional awareness, always present, of the case sitting in the background like weather on the horizon. There was also something changing between them that she didn't examine too closely because she didn't yet have the right language for it. It was not the dramatic thing, not the thing she'd read about in the few novels she'd had access to over the years, the consuming fever of it. It was quieter and more daily. It was the way he'd started telling her things without being asked, the small observations of the day, the things that bothered him, the things that had gone well. It was the way she'd started reading by the fire in the evenings instead of going to bed early, and the way that became expected, the two of them in the front room with the work of the day done, and it was comfortable in a way that didn't require management. She thought sometimes about what the woman in the Copperfield General Store had said to her that first week. "We'll see how long you last." She thought about what she would say to that woman now and decided the accurate answer was too long and too complicated, and she probably wouldn't bother. The first September storm of the year arrived early and angry. It had been building for 2 days, the sky doing that particular thing it did in Montana before a serious weather event. A heaviness and a color shift and a stillness in the air that she'd learned to read as reliably as a written warning. Ellis had said it would be bad. Ellis had a record on weather predictions that was better than the almanac in her experience. He had not predicted how bad. The storm hit on a Tuesday night, and by Wednesday morning it was the kind of weather that made the previous winter's cold seem like a disagreement. The temperature dropped 30 degrees in 6 hours. The wind went from present to violent, the kind of wind that didn't just press against structures but pushed through them, finding the gaps she'd caulked, and some she hadn't found yet. The snow was not the soft kind. It was horizontal and hard, and it reduced visibility to approximately the length of her arm. The cattle were in the north pasture. Caleb had moved them there 4 days ago, when the summer grazing rotation had shifted. The north pasture was partially sheltered by a ridge, but the temporary shelters they'd built there were constructed for early fall weather, not for this. And the cattle needed to be moved to the main barn, or enough of them would freeze to make the financial picture of the legal case irrelevant, because there wouldn't be a viable ranch left to fight over. "I'll go," Caleb said. I was already in his heaviest coat, the one that lived by the door in winter. "Ellis is down," she said. This was the piece that made everything harder. Ellis had caught something in his chest the week before, not severe enough to put him in bed entirely, but severe enough that she'd been quietly watching him and redirecting him away from the heaviest work for days. He was in the bunkhouse and had been since yesterday, which was the first time in 8 years she'd been told he'd taken a day off, and she took that as a more accurate indicator of his condition than anything he'd say directly. "I know Ellis is down," Caleb said. "I'll go alone." "That's not— I've done it alone before," he said, not dismissing her, just stating it. She looked at the window. The snow was so thick it was almost opaque. "Take the rope," she said. "Tie off at the barn door and run a line to the fence, the way Ellis showed me in January, so you have a guide back." He looked at her with that look, the revision look. "Yeah," he said. "That's right." He went out. She watched from the window until she couldn't see him anymore, which took about 30 seconds. Then she went to the kitchen, put more wood on the stove, checked that the water was warm, and began staging what would be needed when he came back. Blankets, dry clothes, the specific practical preparation for someone returning from serious cold. She was good at this now. The ranch had taught her in the way that real teachers teach, through consequence. An hour passed. She checked the window. White and wind and nothing else. Another hour. She added wood to the stove. She went to check on Ellis, who was awake and unhappy about being incapacitated and unhappier about the storm. She told him Caleb had gone to move the cattle. Ellis said something she couldn't quite make out, but whose general tone was clear. "He took the rope," she said. "I made sure." Ellis looked at her. "How long?" 2 hours. A pause that was more communicative than most people's sentences. "He should have been back," Ellis said. "I know," she said. She went back to the main house, stood at the window for 5 minutes. The storm showed no interest in moderating. She thought about what could go wrong in this weather. She had a complete and detailed understanding of what could go wrong in this weather because she'd spent a year learning everything that could go wrong on this land. A person could become disoriented. The rope line, if it had broken or come loose at either end, could leave someone circling in a whiteout believing they were moving toward the barn and actually moving away from it. A person could fall in this wind, and if the fall was bad enough, they might not be able to get back up immediately. And in 30-degree cold, the time between can't get up and can't get up at all was shorter than most people realized. She stood at the window for 2 more minutes. Then she put on every layer she owned. She told herself she was being sensible, not panicked, that she was making a practical assessment and responding to it. That was true as far as it went. The part she didn't examine too carefully was the part underneath it. The part that felt like an answer to something she'd been carrying since October, since she'd arrived at this station in the cold dawn, since a man in a weathered hat had said her name with certainty, since she'd learned to read his silences and he'd started telling her things he didn't tell anyone else. She tied off to the barn door the way Ellis had shown her, ran the line to the fence. Then she moved along the fence line toward the north pasture, keeping contact with the rope or the fence at all times, not releasing it, not stopping. She couldn't see more than a few feet in any direction. The wind took her breath away when she faced into it and required deliberate management. Angle her body, breathe when she turned slightly sideways, keep moving. She called his name twice, and the wind swallowed it immediately. There was no point in calling. She focused on the fence line. One post, then the next. Count them. She knew how many posts were between the main barn and the north pasture gate. She'd walked this line enough times to know. She counted. At the north pasture gate, she stopped and tried to see anything through the white. She heard the cattle before she saw them. The low, miserable sound of animals who knew something was wrong, coming from the shelter at the east end of the pasture, which meant Caleb had gotten them there, which meant he'd made it to the pasture, which meant something had happened after. She moved along the fence line inside the pasture. The ground here was uneven. She knew that too. She'd twisted her ankle on the same root in the same place twice and had the memory in her body, if not precisely in her mind. She went carefully, not fast, one hand on the fence. She almost stepped on him. He was at the base of the fence, on the ground, with his back against the post and his head down and his coat wrapped around him as much as he'd been able to manage, which told her he'd been conscious long enough to do that, which was something. She dropped to her knees beside him and put her hand on his face, and his skin was shockingly cold, but not the worst kind of cold. Not the waxy, giving cold that meant you were past the important moments. Caleb. He moved. Not much. His eyes opened and focused on her with the slow effort of someone coming back from somewhere. Lydia. His voice was thick, rougher than usual. Something gave in the shelter frame. I was moving the last group in the beam. He stopped. My leg. She looked at his leg. His right leg was at a wrong angle below the knee. Not badly wrong, not a compound fracture, but wrong. He'd fallen and he hadn't been able to get back up. And in this cold, that distinction was the difference between walking home and not. All right, she said. Her voice was very calm. She would be surprised about that later. I'm going to get you up. You're going to have to help me. You can't. I know what I can and can't do, she said. We're going to do this in stages. First, I need you sitting straighter against the post. Can you push with your arms? He could, barely. The cold had gotten into his hands, but he could. She got him sitting upright. Then she got under his left arm, with his arm across her shoulders, and she braced her feet and straightened her back the way she'd learned from lifting feed sacks. Hips first, back straight, the weight distributed correctly. And she stood up, and he stood with her. And he made a sound she'd never heard him make before, brief and involuntary. The sound a man makes when pain exceeds the threshold he's built to contain it silently. I've got you, she said. Yeah, he said, breathing. Don't stop. Keep going. Yeah. They went back along the fence line, slower than she'd come, much slower. Every post was a negotiation, his weight shifting, her compensating, the two of them finding the balance between moving and not falling together, which would have ended things. She couldn't speak, mostly. What breath she had went to keeping upright in the wind. He talked sometimes, low and not always fully coherent. The cold was in him enough for that. She wasn't sure all of it was directed at her. He said Ellis's name once. He said something about the barn she couldn't hear. He said, at some point near the pasture gate, in a voice that sounded like him but stripped of its usual management, I didn't want you to come out here. I know, she said. It's bad out here. I know it's bad. Keep walking. You should have stayed, Caleb. She stopped briefly to readjust her grip. If you want to argue about this, wait until we're inside. A silence. Then something that was almost a laugh, that fractured on the wind before it could fully form. Okay, he said. They kept going. The gate. The fence line back to the barn. The barn door where the rope was still tied, which she'd been holding on to in her mind as a fixed point since she'd left it. She got him inside the barn and out of the wind and the comparative warmth of the barn, which was not genuinely warm but was out of the wind, felt like stepping into summer. She lowered him onto a hay bale, her arms shaking from exertion she hadn't let herself acknowledge until now. She checked him methodically, his face, his hands, his right leg, which he couldn't put weight on. He was cold throughout, but his fingers responded, his toes responded when she made him move them. "You're not frostbitten," she said. "My leg. The leg is broken or badly sprained. We're going to deal with that inside." She straightened up. "Can you get to the house?" "I can try. That's all I need." She got him to the house the same way she'd gotten him across the pasture. His arm across her shoulders, her hip against his side, both of them moving as one crooked and effortful thing through the storm. The distance between the barn and the house was not large. It felt very large. Inside, door shut. The warmth of the kitchen stove hit her face, and she stood for a moment just accepting it, not moving, because she needed the second. Then she settled him into the chair nearest the stove and went to work. Wet coat off. Dry clothes from the stack she'd staged. Blankets. She worked the way she worked best, systematically, without stopping, with the particular clarity that arrived when there was a real and specific problem to be solved, and sentimentality would slow her down. His leg was a fracture, clean, she thought, but she wasn't a doctor, and she told him so while she was splinting it with what she had, which was 2 straight boards from the woodpile and the strips of cloth she'd learned to keep on hand because this was a ranch, and things broke on ranches, including people. He was more alert by this point, which she took as improvement. He sat through the splinting with his teeth set and his eyes on the ceiling and didn't complain out loud, which she appreciated because the moment he complained was the moment she might lose her composure and she needed to finish the splint first. When it was done, she sat back on her heels and her hands were shaking slightly, which she noticed with the detached interest of someone observing something from a mile distance. "Doctor," she said, "tomorrow, if the storm clears enough. Today is going to be management." "I know," he said. His voice was clearer now. His eyes were on her, very direct. "Lydia." "Don't," she said. "I wasn't going to say anything difficult." She looked at him. "I was going to say thank you," he said. She looked at him for a moment and then looked at her hands, which had steadied somewhat. "You would have done the same," she said. "I would have," he said. "That's not why I'm saying it." She understood what he meant. He was saying it because it had happened, and it mattered that it had happened, and he was not a man who let things that mattered pass by without at least naming them. "You're welcome," she said. He reached across and put his hand over hers briefly and then let go, and she got up and went to check the stove and told herself she was fine, in a way that was not quite accurate but close enough to function. Outside, the storm continued its business, indifferent to all of it. Inside the old house, with the fire in the hearth and the sound of the wind pressing at every wall, Lydia Mercer understood, without ceremony, without the arrival of any single definitive moment, that she was no longer afraid of anything this land could send at her. Not because the fear was gone, she'd just learned something stronger than it. The storm broke on Thursday morning. Lydia knew it before she opened her eyes. There was a quality to the silence that was different from the storm's silence, which had been the silence of everything being swallowed. This was the silence of aftermath, of a world that had been rearranged overnight and was now sitting still, waiting to be assessed. She'd slept in the chair by the stove, not intentionally. She'd sat down after midnight, after the last time she'd checked on Caleb and banked the fire, and checked on Ellis through the window, and her body had made the decision without consulting her. Caleb was asleep in the bed she'd moved him to around 10 o'clock, with Ellis's help once Ellis had dragged himself from the bunkhouse in flagrant defiance of his own condition. Between the two of them, they'd managed it. Caleb's legs splinted and elevated, his color coming back, his temperature returning to something that didn't alarm her. She stood at the kitchen window and looked at the world the storm had left. Snow to the top of the fence posts on the north side, the barn roof holding, the cattle shelters in the north pasture. She could see from here that one had partially collapsed, which she'd expected, which was manageable. Manageable. That word had become her internal measure of everything over the past year. She put the coffee on and went to check on Caleb. He was awake, which didn't surprise her. He was lying with his eyes on the ceiling in the way he had when he was thinking, and when she came in, he looked at her with the direct attention he'd been giving her since the barn, more openly than before, like something that had been held back had been released by the events of the night and hadn't been put back yet. "How's the leg?" she said. "Hurts," he said. "That's honest." "Everything feels like it's been wrung out," he said, "but I can feel my feet, so." "So," she agreed. She checked the splint. It had held, which meant she'd done it correctly. which she filed away with quiet satisfaction. Then she told him about the barn roof and the collapsed shelter and the cattle count she'd done by sight from the window. He listened, and when she finished, he said, "You went out and looked." "Just from the yard," she said. "The worst is manageable." A pause. "Lydia," he said. "About last night." "I know," she said. "I need to say it." She waited. "You didn't hesitate," he said. "You just came." He was looking at her with something that was tired and honest and more open than she was used to seeing on his face. "I've been out here a long time, since Margaret, and I'd gotten used to managing things alone. That felt like the only version available." He stopped. "It's not anymore." She sat on the edge of the bed, which was not something she did, and looked at him. "No," she said. "It's not." "I'm glad you came," he said. "Not just last night. In October. All of it." She thought about a lot of responses and chose the simplest and most accurate one. "So am I," she said. The doctor came from Copperfield on Friday, riding through snow that had drifted to the horse's knees on the low sections, and confirmed what she'd suspected: a clean fracture of the fibula, not the tibia, which was the better of the two options. The splint had been correctly applied, which the doctor mentioned with a mildly impressed expression that she found more satisfying than she probably should have. 6 weeks, he said. Weight off it for 4, partial weight for 2 more. Caleb received this information with the expression of a man being told the earth was flat. Possible to hear, not possible to accept. 6 weeks, Ellis said from the doorway, in a tone that conveyed he found the concept equally foreign. His own chest had improved with 2 days of enforced rest, which he seemed to regard as the storm doing him a personal insult. 4 weeks of no weight, Lydia said, looking at both of them. Then we'll see. Both men looked at her. The look that meant they understood she was the authority on this, and were arriving at peace with that fact through gritted teeth. Fine, Caleb said. Fine, Ellis said. She thanked the doctor and paid him and walked him out, and on the porch, he paused and looked at her with the directness of medical men who'd seen a lot of situations. You set that splint right, he said. In those conditions, in the dark, with someone you were scared for, that's not nothing. She nodded. He's lucky, the doctor said. He worked hard to get to the fence line, she said. He did what he could. The doctor looked at her for a moment. I meant he's lucky in a broader sense, he said, and walked to his horse. She stood on the porch in the cold morning air and let that sit for a moment. Then she went back inside to argue with Caleb about whether he could walk to the barn to check on the cattle himself, or whether Ellis could do it and report back. She won the argument. She was getting better at that too. The trial date was set for October, exactly 1 year, almost to the week, from the day she'd stepped off the train in Copperfield. Drummond came in September to prepare, staying 4 days this time, going through every document in the correct order with the methodical patience of a man who understood that cases were won and lost on preparation before anyone entered a room together. He had retained an additional attorney in Millhaven to assist, a younger man named Pierce, who was sharp and had the additional advantage of knowing the county judge personally from his days as a clerk in the same courthouse. Albright is fair, Pierce told them, sitting at the kitchen table with his notes. He doesn't like fancy maneuvering, and he doesn't like it when big operations lean on smaller ones. If we can show him the pattern clearly— The notebook shows it clearly, Drummond said. Then we show him the notebook. The trial itself was 2 days. She had thought, in the weeks leading up to it, that she would be frightened. She had spent enough time with fear in the past year to know its particular texture, how it arrived, and how it worked on her. But when she sat down in that courtroom beside Drummond and Caleb, with Ellis behind them and Clara Finch in the row behind that, she found something else in the place where the fear should have been. Readiness. Just that. The quiet, unspectacular state of someone who has done everything that could be done and now has to let the doing speak for itself. Victor Holloway sat across the room with his 2 Helena attorneys in a posture of absolute confidence that she recognized and was no longer impressed by. She had learned to see through that particular performance. She'd grown up watching her uncle wear it. The first day was technical. Survey records, the hydrological evidence, the competing claims filed by Clearwater Valley Properties. Holloway's attorneys were skilled at making the documentation appear complicated, which was the point. Complexity benefited them because complexity invited delay, and delay cost money that small operations didn't have. But Drummond was patient and Pierce was precise, and the 1887 letters were, as Drummond had predicted, impossible to dismiss. The territorial acknowledgement they contained had been cross-referenced against the reorganization records of 1890, and Pierce had found, in a Helena archive, the actual administrative transfer file that proved the Mercer water claim had been noted for registration and had been lost not through abandonment, but through bureaucratic dissolution. When that document was presented, something happened in the courtroom that was subtle but definite. A shift. The kind of shift you feel before you can see it. A change in the quality of attention in the room, a slight forward lean from Judge Albright. Holloway's senior attorney requested an adjournment until morning. Albright granted it with a look that suggested he'd grant it, but had opinions about why it was being requested. That evening, she and Caleb and Drummond and Pierce sat in the small hotel dining room in Mill Haven and went over the next day's testimony, and Drummond ate more than she'd seen him eat at any one sitting, which she took as a sign that he was feeling good about things and was allowing himself to feel it. Tomorrow they'll attack the pattern evidence, Drummond said. The notebook entries. They'll call it circumstantial. It is circumstantial, she said. Yes, Drummond said, but the photographs are not. And the two taken together, with the dates, he tapped his finger on the table. The judge is going to see what it is. She thought about what it was. She'd spent a year building the case, entry by entry, photograph by photograph, the whole careful architecture of it. She thought about Ellis finding the letters under the barn floor. She thought about writing in the notebook at 2 a.m. after the fire, her hands still smelling of smoke, because she'd known even then that the record was the weapon. He's done this before, she said. We said that in March. If there are other properties. There are, Pierce said quietly. He looked up from his notes. I did some digging. The Wyoming case Drummond mentioned. There were 2 others. Colorado in 1888. A smaller one in Idaho in 91. In each case, the documentation was thin. People sold or gave up before it got to court. He looked at her. Nothing like this. She thought about those other people, the ones who'd signed or walked away because they couldn't see a way through. She thought about her parents' dining room table and the pen and her uncle's hand. Then let the record show all of it, she said. The second day was hers. She testified for 2 hours and 20 minutes. She had been worried, in the weeks before, about whether she would hold together under sustained cross-examination from lawyers who were paid to find the gap in a person's account and push on it. She had prepared for it the way she prepared for everything, by thinking through every weakness in her own position before they could find it and having an answer ready. Holloway's attorney was good. She gave him that. He was methodical, and he asked questions in sequences designed to build toward implications rather than stating them directly, which was the skillful version of the thing. He questioned the timing of the notebook's commencement. Wasn't it convenient that she had begun documenting from the very first week? He questioned her qualifications to identify a deliberate fire versus an accidental one. He questioned whether a young woman newly arrived from the city had the experience necessary to accurately interpret what she'd observed. She answered each question the same way, plainly, specifically, without becoming defensive and without backing down. She had the dates, she had the photographs. She had the copies from the county records office, which she had obtained herself on a 40-mile wagon ride in February, which was not the action of someone constructing a retroactive narrative. When he asked her, near the end, why she had begun documenting from the very first week, implying she had arrived with some predisposition toward conflict, she looked at him steadily and said, "Because I grew up watching a man spend 15 years building a case to take my family's property. And when he finally made his move, we had nothing on paper. I wasn't going to make that mistake again." The courtroom was very quiet for a moment. Judge Albright wrote something down. Holloway's attorney moved to a different line of questioning, which was the clearest signal she could have received. Albright delivered his ruling 3 weeks later, in writing. Drummond sent it to them by express mail with a cover letter that was 2 sentences long, which was its own kind of communication. The ruling is in your favor on all primary counts. I'll be there Thursday. She read the ruling at the kitchen table with Caleb beside her, both of them reading at the same pace, which they'd developed without deciding to. The language was legal and dense, but the meaning was not obscure. The Clearwater Valley Properties water rights filing was ruled invalid on the grounds of prior claim. The 1887 territorial acknowledgement, combined with evidence of continuous use and the 1890 administrative disruption, established the Mercer water right as predating and superseding the 1903 filing. The competing claim was dismissed. The court further noted, in language that was measured but pointed, a pattern of interference with the Mercer property's water access that the court found consistent with deliberate obstruction and ordered to cease. Holloway's name did not appear in the ruling. Clearwater Valley Properties did. But there was no question about what the ruling meant or who it affected. She set the papers down. Caleb was looking at the wall. She knew that look, the processing look, the 2 or 3 seconds he needed to convert something significant from external fact into internal reality. Then he looked at her. She looked back. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Not because there was nothing to say, but because some moments don't need to be spoken into. She had learned that from him, actually. That particular economy with words, the understanding that silence can hold things that speech might diminish. Then Caleb said very quietly, "My father would have liked you." She felt that in her chest. "Tell me about him," she said. So he did, right there at the kitchen table, with the ruling sitting between them, for the first time at length. The elder Mercer, who had built the barn in 11 days and kept a box of letters under the barn floor because he trusted the land more than he trusted banks, who had raised his son in the particular way of frontier fathers, through demonstration rather than instruction, through the daily evidence of what work and honesty looked like. She listened and thought about her own father, not the diminished version she'd known in his last years, worn down by failed cases and the grinding economics of honesty in a world that didn't always reward it, but the earlier one, the one who'd shown her how evidence worked and how a case was built, and what a person who had nothing but the truth on their side could still do with it. 2 fathers, in different times and different places, doing their imperfect best to leave something useful behind. It hadn't been what either of them planned, but here it was. Drummond came on Thursday and brought Pierce, and they sat around the table and talked through the final paperwork, the formal registration of the water right, the documentation to file with the county, the cease and desist language that would be served on Clearwater Valley Properties, which everyone in the room understood meant Victor Holloway, even if the ruling's language was careful. "He'll challenge the water registration," Drummond said. "Probably. One more filing, some delay." "Let him," Lydia said. "We'll respond." Drummond looked at her. After a moment he smiled, which was rare enough on his face that it registered. "Yes," he said. "You will." What she hadn't anticipated, what surprised her more than she expected to be surprised by anything at this point, was what happened in town. The ruling had been a matter of public record, filed at the county courthouse, and in a community of Copperfield's size, public record moved faster than mail. Within a week, she began to notice something different in how people looked at her and spoke to her in the street. Not dramatic, not an overnight transformation. Real life didn't work that way, and she was no longer young enough to think it did. But something incremental and genuine. Grady at the feed store processed her order without the elaborate unhelpfulness he'd been deploying since October. He didn't apologize, which she hadn't expected. But the order was ready when he said it would be, and he looked at the counter when he handed her the receipt instead of somewhere over her head. It was, she thought, the closest thing to an apology a man like Grady was capable of, and she accepted it as such without comment. Clara Finch, when she came for coffee the following week, was more direct. Clara was always more direct. "Copperfield has been watching Holloway run over people for 20 years, Clara said, with a frank anger that Lydia had come to depend on. Watching him and not doing much about it. And now—" She stopped. "People feel things about that." "I'm not interested in making people feel bad," Lydia said. "That's what makes them feel bad," Clara said. "The fact that you're not interested in it." She thought about that. The conversation that mattered most, though, came from an unexpected direction. A man named Garrett Howe, who ran a small farm on the valley's northern edge, came to the ranch one afternoon in November. She'd seen him in town before, but didn't know him beyond a nodded acknowledgement. He was older, 60 maybe, with the weathered permanence of someone who'd been in this country a long time. He stood in the yard and turned his hat in his hands and said, "I heard about the ruling and the letters." "Yes," she said. "I had a similar situation," he said. 8 years ago. Holloway's company made a filing on a water source adjacent to my place. My wife and I, we looked at what it would cost to fight it, and we couldn't see a way." He was quiet for a moment. "We signed an easement, gave him legal access to a third of our creek flow." He looked up at her. "What you showed was possible, that it could be fought and won. I just wanted you to know that matters. To people who couldn't do it the first time." She looked at him for a moment. "Do you still have the easement documents?" she said. He blinked. "Yes." "Drummond is still in Helena through the end of the year," she said. "It might be worth sending him a letter. What you signed under pressure, with a clear pattern of coercion, now on the record." She paused. "Things look different in light of new evidence. That's how the law is supposed to work." Howe stared at her. "I'm not promising anything," she said. "I'm saying it's worth asking." He wrote the letter. She didn't know yet what would come of it, but she knew that the record she'd built in that composition book from the back, in her careful handwriting, had become something larger than the two people it had been built to protect. That was not what she'd planned. She hadn't been planning anything larger than survival when she'd first started writing. But intention and outcome are rarely the same thing, and sometimes the gap between them is where something worth keeping lives. The school was Clara's idea, technically, or Clara's loudest idea, since Clara had many. The Valley had no formal school. Children were educated at home if they were educated at all, which depended entirely on what their parents knew and what time could be spared. Clara had been teaching her own two children at the kitchen table and had run out of patience with the limitation of that arrangement. She came to Lydia in December with the idea and a look that suggested she already knew the answer would be yes, and was only here as a courtesy. "You have the space," Clara said. "That front room is big enough for 10 children. Easy." "It's our front room," Lydia said. "You use it for legal documents." "I use it for legal documents and—" She stopped. Clara was looking at her. "You've already spoken to other families." 7 families, Clara said without apology. 14 children, Monday through Friday, 3 hours in the morning. You teach reading and arithmetic and I'll do the rest." She thought about it for approximately 6 seconds. "We'll need a proper blackboard. Thomas will build one. And more desks." "Ellis," Clara said, with the confidence of someone who had already assessed the situation and assigned the resources. "You've thought about this more than you're letting on," Lydia said. "I've thought about it since the first week you were here," Clara said. "I was just waiting for things to settle enough to ask." The school opened in January. Not a real school building, just the front room, with the legal documents moved to the back room where they lived now in the proper organization system she'd developed. And 8 children on the first morning, ranging from 6 to 14, sitting in a row of chairs and 2 new desks with the particular mixture of skepticism and curiosity that children bring to new situations. She stood in front of them and felt briefly the old thing, the awareness of her own inadequacy, the list of things she didn't know how to do. She was not a teacher. She had never taught anyone anything. Then she thought about the stove's hot left side, and the bread that had eventually been good, and the splint she'd applied in the dark during a blizzard. "We're going to start with what you know," she said, "and build from there." It was, she would think later, the only philosophy she'd ever actually operated from. She just hadn't put it into words before. She found out she was pregnant in February, on a Wednesday morning when the certainty of it became impossible to argue with, and she sat in the kitchen by the stove for a few minutes before she told anyone, just sitting with it, the weight of it, the reality of it, the fact that this new life had decided to start in this specific place, in a house that had been empty, and a marriage that had been practical, and a life she'd built from the back end of a newspaper. She told Caleb that evening. He was at the table with the cattle ledger, which he'd started keeping more carefully since she'd shown him the system she'd developed for tracking costs versus returns. He looked up when she sat down across from him, and she didn't lead into it because there was no way to lead into it that wasn't just delay. "I'm pregnant," she said. A silence. Not the processing silence, something different, something that went a little longer than processing required. When he looked at her, his face was open, in the way it had been open in small moments over the past year, but fully this time, without the usual management. "Are you all right?" he said. "Yes," she said. "Are you?" He thought about it honestly, which she'd always respected about him, the refusal to perform the expected response when the real one was available. "Yeah," he said. I am. And then, after another moment, more than all right. She nodded. Me too. Ellis, when he was told, said nothing for 4 seconds and then said, I'll fix the upstairs window, the one that drafts, and went back to what he was doing, which was his exact version of joy. Clara cried, which remained her response to most significant events, and then immediately began making plans for things that Lydia gently redirected into smaller, more realistic projects. The pregnancy was not comfortable. She had expected this. She hadn't expected anything about Montana to be comfortable, and the pattern had held. But she managed it the way she managed everything, which was by continuing to work at a modified pace and refusing to treat herself as fragile. Caleb worried more than he said, which she could measure by the increased frequency of his standing in doorways when she was in the room. She found it simultaneously unnecessary and quietly sustaining. The school continued through spring. She taught for as long as she could manage comfortably, and Clara covered the days she couldn't. By April, there were 11 children coming regularly, which exceeded the original 14 family count because word had reached farms she hadn't known were within distance. Garrett Howe's letter to Drummond had resulted in something: a supplementary filing, a challenge to the easement he'd signed under coercion. It was early, Drummond cautioned, but the new evidence from the Mercer case provided a changed context. Howe wasn't the only one. A woman named Sutton, 2 valleys north, had written separately after hearing through Clara's extensive communication network what had been established in Mill Haven. Lydia had documented in one composition book from the back had become, somehow, a kind of illumination for people who'd been told they'd seen nothing worth documenting. She hadn't planned that either. The baby was born in June. A girl, 7 pounds, with Caleb's dark eyes and a set of opinions about the world that she made audible immediately and with considerable force. They named her Ruth. Caleb held her with the careful, slightly stunned attention of a man doing something for the first time that he has been waiting for without knowing he was waiting. He didn't say anything for a long time. When he did speak, he said very quietly, to the baby specifically, "We've got you. You're all right." She was not all right. She was vigorously objecting to existence in the way of all newborns. But she settled when he said it, which Lydia noted with the particular attention of a woman who had spent the past year learning to read a man's silences and now understood that his voice, when he chose to use it, carried a specific weight. Clara came the following morning and held Ruth and told Lydia 3 things that were practical and useful and 1 thing that was purely sentimental, which was unusual enough for Clara that Lydia paid close attention. "You built something real here," Clara said, not looking at her, looking at the baby. "I want you to know that somebody sees that." She thought about what she'd built. Not the legal case, not the school, not the ranch's restored stability. All of that was real, but it wasn't what Clara meant. Clara meant the daily thing. The thing that had been constructed one ordinary day at a time, from burned bread and caulked windows and conversations in the dark, and a composition book written from the back. She thought about what she'd been the first morning she'd stood on a train platform in a town she didn't know. 18 years old, $43 in her shoe, frightened in a way that she'd had to hold very still to keep from showing. She was not that person anymore. Or rather, she was still that person, with everything that person had been, but she was also everything that had been added since. The ranch had added to her. Caleb had added to her. The cold and the work and the fear and the specific education of a year spent discovering what she was actually capable of, all of it had added to her, layer by layer, the way good foundation is built. She was not a better person. She was not a completed person. She suspected that was a category that didn't exist. But she was a more fully herself person, which was the thing she hadn't known she was looking for when she'd mailed that first letter to a stranger in Montana and asked for a fair chance. She'd gotten more than a fair chance. She'd gotten the specific, unglamorous, irreplaceable thing of being taken seriously. The rest she'd built herself. In August, Drummond wrote to say that Victor Holloway had dissolved Clearwater Valley Properties. No announcement, no statement. The company simply ceased to appear in new filings, and the existing legal proceedings in Mill Haven found themselves facing an opponent who had stopped engaging. Whether it was the court ruling, the pattern of evidence now on record, the supplementary cases building around it, or some combination she'd never fully know, the pressure that had been directed at the Mercer Ranch for years simply withdrew, the way certain storms do, Not with a final dramatic gesture, but by degrees, until one day you look up and the sky is different. She wrote the final entry in the notebook that evening. August 14. No new filings. Clearwater Valley Properties dissolved. The water right is registered in our name. The land is ours. Then she closed the notebook and put it on the shelf next to her father's letter. The only thing she had left in his handwriting, a short note from years before that she'd found in her mother's things and kept for reasons she hadn't needed to examine. She stood there for a moment in the back room with the August light coming through the window she'd resealed last October, and she thought about all the versions of herself that had stood in rooms like this, frightened, uncertain, running out of options, and how none of them had known what the next room contained. She hadn't known either. That was the part nobody told you, and that you couldn't learn until you'd done it, that you don't walk toward the future because you can see it. You walk because you decide to. The courage isn't knowing what's ahead. The courage is the walking itself, into the specific unknown of your own life, with everything you have and nothing guaranteed. She'd walked, imperfectly, afraid, with burned bread and wrong turns and arguments she'd lost and situations she'd misread, and a list of inadequacies that had never fully disappeared, only changed. She'd walked anyway. Outside, Ruth was making herself known from the cradle in the kitchen. That escalating pre-cry that Lydia had already learned to distinguish from the actual cry, the sound of someone deciding whether to be upset yet. She heard Caleb's voice, low and even, the same voice he used for startled horses and frightened cattle, and apparently also for daughters, and after a moment the escalation stopped. She listened to the quiet that followed, the specific quiet of the ranch in summer, wind in the grass, something moving in the barn, the distant sound of Ellis doing whatever Ellis was always doing, the old house settling around all of them. She turned off the lamp and went back to her family.